This is part 5 of our series in Workers and Resources Soviet Republic. We are still in Kazinchad in 1910, still developing the village ready for a 1910 start. It's not really my intention, as I've explained before, to play the game from here. It's to get it into a playable condition rather than to actually play. But what of course I would like to be able to do is to move away from a small village environment and build a city. But we have to make sure that we have addressed the various systems in the game before we can move on. We need to get Kazinchad completed and address all of the issues with playing this game 50 years before the developers intended. Anyway, my name is Mark from Canny Gaming, and today we will look at how to deal with water and sewage in our village in 1910. Looking at the rules I set for myself, I had that waste is disabled in 1910 and starts in 1930. Well, I'm going to change that. I think that's incorrect. I think I can handle waste, but I'm not going to cover it today. Water and sewage disabled in 1910 and starts in 1940. I originally had this idea that I would put water and sewage in later. This was partly to do with the fact that by 1910 there may not have been properly plumbed in water systems with pumped water through water treatment plants and things like that. And that might kick in only into the 1930s and 40s. But in fact, I'm going to change that as well. After I first set this up, I decided that's wrong. I think we should try to cover as many of these systems as possible, even in 1910. And then the third one is seasons are disabled in 1910 and only starts in 1950. And that's because that would then allow to run a modern heating plant. And that is wrong. We've already covered that in episode 4 when we set up a firewood merchant. The firewood merchant acts in the same way as a heating plant in the game, of providing heating to other buildings. Now, in terms of the dates, let's just remind ourselves that the game shows it is April 1910. But all of what we're doing here is intended to be stuff that is not done in April 1910, but it is pre-1910. It's things that existed in the village before 1910, in some cases many years before 1910. So we are not trying to pretend that the firewood merchant was built in 1910. We are role-playing the idea that in 1910 we've had a firewood merchant in this village perhaps as long as the village has been here. People needed some way of heating their homes and to get firewood to do that. The landowner of the estate, all the land around here, is the Kovac family, of course. But in 1910 we are not living in a planned economy where the state is providing heating to people. The firewood merchant is an independent business which is not associated with the Kovac estate. The Kovac family don't own the firewood merchant. The wood is harvested on their estate and the firewood merchant buys the wood from them. One thing I should mention is that off camera I've used the landscape editor mode to add quite a lot more forest around here. I had placed some fields around the edge of the village, but there's plenty more land down here towards the border. I was not intending to develop farming in this area by having more fields anyway, and we need somewhere to get the wood to sell to the firewood merchant. So in this case, I think we could use the vanilla wood cutting post here. It's not a particularly modern looking asset and doesn't have any features that are a problem to us, except it uses an asphalt loading and storage area. And as you know, I want to avoid that this early. So I created a copy of the vanilla wood cutter and changed that, but everything else pretty much remains the same. We have unlimited money still, but we are not taking advantage of this. So let me then just buy the cheapest option, which is a one-horse wagon. They have a fairly basic speed level of collecting the trees because they have no sort of mechanism like a small crane that's built on the side of the modern trucks to lift the trees onto the wagon. Anyway, I'm going to keep the wood cutting fairly small scale for now, so I think I can just buy one of them. In the village, the total number of workers is about 150, and with the shift system, that means we could end up employing 30 to 40 workers here. That's a big chunk of our workforce. We may not be able to reduce the work as much because we have to ensure that we produce enough wood per year for the firewood merchant. We don't want to import firewood. Some workers in the village can actually get to this by walking to it. It's not far from the village. but it's only about a dozen houses in the village. So that effectively limits the number of workers. But if we have to get more workers there, we can run a bus from the village square. So let's get a couple of open holes in the road depot. I want vehicles to bring wood to the firewood merchant. I'll put them to wait until unloaded. I'm okay with that. There's not a problem with waiting because I think we've got enough parking capacity. It's something to be careful about, but I created these mods to have 3 vehicle stations to try to avoid problems with vehicles queuing up and getting in each other's way. That can be particularly bad if you have something like a waste truck arrives at this firewood merchant when there are vehicles queued up waiting to drop off firewood, so the waste wouldn't be able to be picked up. We definitely don't want that. I'll just save the line and set that line on the other vehicle as well and launch him so they're both on there. So I think that completes the firewood merchant now. We could even start this off, let the game play, and we should see that happening. But I don't want to let the game play too far because I now have water enabled and no water yet in the village. One of the things which I had looked at, which I think is slightly disappointing in some ways, is having water inside of a village. We know historically many village communities are situated around a well. Let's go to a modern water well. So this is the vanilla small water well, and it's a fairly big asset despite the name when you see it next to these village assets. But the main point I want to show here is that there are no blue lines going from this well. If I use instead a modded asset like this traditional looking well, it also has no blue lines going from it to the houses, unlike if we put a water substation in. You see the difference, for instance, for heating. If you put a heating plant here in the middle of the village, like our firewood merchant, it connects with the red lines to all of the buildings that are within about 400 metres. And a power plant connects with the yellow lines within about 230 metres. Not that you'd want to build a modern power plant in the middle of this village, but there are some small portable generator type assets available in the workshop that run off fuel. You can drop one of those in the middle of a village, and they can run without a substation, but a well for water will not. 2 points about this sort of village well. The first thing, if you were to put this asset down inside your village, you'll see that the water quality is only about 80%. The water quality runs down from 100% pure water, which you can get from the customs house, through 95%, which is the maximum that you would get from a well. So if you're not importing water, then to get anything above 95%, you need to treat it through a water treatment plant. But if I was to put this anywhere in this village, you see that there's mainly yellow dots around it, only a few green ones. And anywhere where there's yellow dots, it is detecting some sort of a pollution or contamination. It's minor pollution, but it is enough to reduce the water quality. If I was then to go outside the village, you'll see that as soon as I get away from the houses, I get up to about 89–90%. I'm still getting some yellow dots from the fields. The fields also reduce the water quality because there is an assumption that there's some sort of fertilizer on the fields that would get into the water and affect the quality. So from here you can get 90%. Now I can tell you straight away, if you'd never tried this, you will kill all the people in this village if you put a well in the middle of the village. With about 80% water, you are not far off giving them sewage to drink. So yeah, you can't do that. You can't put a well in the village. Which I think is a bit odd when many villages historically have a supply of water from a well that had been dug into the ground rather than taking drinking water from a river or stream. It's realistic that some contamination of the water could occur, but in most cases the well was fine as long as there was some way of dealing with the sewage in the village. It's unlikely in this period that they would get industrial contamination in a rural situation. The main danger to contaminate the water supply would be from human waste. As long as you had an efficient sewage disposal method, you could deal with that. For the role play, it would be nice to have a village well. but we can't do it. The game won't allow you to do that, even with a mod, as you can't control the quality of the water in any way. I thought of sewage, of course. We can collect the sewage in a sewage tank. This is the vanilla sewage tank, but because it's all below ground and you see very little on the surface, I don't think it really matters to use this asset in 1910 if we had to. We could just drop one of these in the village. Let's ignore for 1 second the elephant in the room, which is the highway we built in episodes 1 and 2, and let's look outside of the village. And there's a river, and it's not very far away. So we could have a sewage tank in the village. There's a very slight slope from the village down towards the river. So the sewage would flow downhill to the river without pumps. And then we would have a sewage outflow and just dump the sewage in the river. So that's a perfectly valid setup in the game, and we definitely could do that. That was my initial idea to do that. Once I had checked and convinced myself by some testing that you cannot put a well here in the village. Now, I mean by that an asset which has the functionality of a well in the game. There are some assets which are described as a well or look like one of those traditional wells, but it's actually acting as a substation. Therefore, it doesn't gather water, it has to have water delivered to it by water truck or piped from a proper well. So I was thinking of some sort of setup where the well was not in the centre of the village. But even something like this with about 90%, you run the risk without a water treatment plant of killing people. In a city playing in 1960, I would just build a vanilla small water treatment plant. You need 5 workers for the water treatment, as well as providing chemicals. That's problematic on both counts for us in Kazinchad in 1910. So I think water treatment is something for the future to consider carefully, but I wanted a setup as close to historically accurate as possible without importing water. We do happen to be close to the customs house here, but that was not intended, and we need solutions that would work in a small village anywhere on the map. In terms of mods available in the workshop for water treatment, there is this nice asset which is from the same asset creator who provided the Central European houses. I'm sure we'll see this asset again later, but this groundwater filtration plant is a big building and it needs 10 people to work in it. It would cost nearly $100,000 to buy, or a lot of steel and quite a lot of concrete to build yourself. Now, I could create a mod which is much smaller, has less people and is much less expensive to build, but I'm not clear how I could justify something that is very cheap to build and operate and still produces the benefit of generating up to about 90% quality of water, depending on how much chemicals you're prepared to consume. And we also can't easily justify using modern chemicals anyway in 1910. So the compromise is to put the well far enough away from the village. Here, close to the fields, it's 89–90%, but as soon as you go out past the fields, you can get right up to 94–95%. I think when you build it, it causes itself a little bit of pollution. So I don't think you can ever get 95% out of it. So I'm going to create a water well about here, just off the main road. Note, roads and footpaths do not cause pollution of the water, only buildings do that. What I want to do is then build one of these wind-powered wells. I'm going to need a technical office to distribute the water, because I'm so far away from the village and I'm not going to pipe it down into the village yet. I'm going to bring it down by cart. Now, I'm going to admit that doesn't feel realistic to me, but it seems to be the best we can do given the fact we can't build a well in the village without killing everyone. So I just want a small technical office. This is a modded technical office that I then further modded to use gravel, adjust the position of the parking and create some skins. It only holds 4 vehicles, but it looks great for 1910. I want to put it there. Now, we have a well that is wind powered and that also solves the issue that we may not be able to supply electricity this far from the village. Now, let me break off from the gameplay to discuss wind power. When you have research enabled, then wind powered electricity generation is blocked at the start of the game. In other words, on a typical 1960s start, you cannot use a wind turbine to generate any electricity. Wind turbines were certainly not something that you would see throughout the 1960s and 70s, so there is some realism to this game restriction. The very first wind farm with 20 wind turbines was built in America in 1980. The first offshore wind farm was built off the coast of Denmark in 1991 with 11. But note, these were intended to be commercial production of electricity on a fairly large scale. It does not mean that wind turbines were only invented around 1980. This is a Halliday windmill, invented in America in 1854. Halliday's design did not generate electricity. On the Great Plains of America, there are not many streams and rivers, not the easy availability of fast-moving small rivers that can drive a mill that they are in Europe. But in particular, the wells that they had to dig were often very deep to reach water. Halliday invented his windmill to drive a mechanical pump to raise water to the surface. It could raise water hundreds of feet. His design was also intended to better withstand very strong winds. This human hamster wheel is an example of what people were still doing in some deep wells in Europe to raise water to the surface. With Halliday's wind-powered well, you could feed the water to a tap or faucet on the surface. But you may need water when there's no wind blowing, so it makes sense that water is fed into a storage tank. These were not only used on farms throughout the American Midwest, but placed along the expanding railway lines to provide a source of water for the steam engines. They became an iconic part of the landscape of rural America and many other countries. Halliday windmills didn't get the same kind of uptake in Europe, but one of these was shipped over to Vienna for an international electrical exhibition in 1883. An Austrian electrical engineer used it to build the very first electricity-generating wind turbine to show at the exhibition. We don't have photos of that, but we do have pictures of the design of how it would be connected to an electricity circuit. The windmill drove a dynamo that fed electricity into a series of batteries. The first practical implementation of this was by a Scottish electrical engineer, Charles Blythe, in 1887. Blythe created a small wind turbine to power electric lights in his holiday home. It was out in the countryside, nowhere near a coal power plant. You see that he used a completely different style of windmill with horizontal arms. It was small, but still produced much more electricity than he needed for one house, and he offered the excess to the local village for street lighting. They declined, saying that electricity was the devil's work. A year later, Charles Brush built this much larger wind turbine in America. It used the same electrical design, but the upright design of the blades. This one was built soon after in Denmark on the right, with a traditional mechanical windmill on the left. While wind turbines to generate electricity were a thing in Europe, there weren't many of them. The batteries were expensive. As time went on, developments in coal-fired turbines and distribution of electricity on medium voltage circuits and high voltage circuits meant that soon even many rural communities could be connected to electrical grids, and there was little need to invest in wind power. Wind generation of electricity did not go much beyond these early pioneers for about 80 years. In the village of Ruprechthof in Czechia in 1873, the traditional blade design of a windmill was destroyed in a storm, and the owner repaired it like this. The original stone building is the same as it was, the blades were new. It's not exactly the Halliday design, but it has a lot in common. This one does not appear to have been used to generate electricity, but to drive the mechanical components to grind flour for bread, etc. I found no records of these being used in Slovakia itself, but there were at least 2 others like this in Moravia, not far away, and it seems a number of mill owners in Central Europe adopted the idea. And we have seen some evidence that the idea was also developed to generate electricity in various places in Europe. The main thing from our point of view is that the game developers are not following the historical production of wind power when they require you to build a technical university in 1960 and then research wind power. It had been researched extensively and tried out and tested in various situations even before 1910. But to be fair to the developers, they are trying to represent the creation of wind-powered plants, whole farms of wind turbines generating megawatts of power, things which did not historically develop until the 1980s onwards. Interest was boosted from the oil crisis of the 1970s and the aim to find other sources of electricity. Scientists hadn't forgotten those early experiments with using a windmill to generate electricity, and battery technology rather than windmill technology was much better. I think we can say that it is not unreasonable to have wind power enabled and available for use on a small scale in 1910. And therefore, even with research enabled, I have modded the game to allow us to use wind power in an early start. Though to be clear, the actual modded asset I am going to use, a wind-powered water well, is not blocked by the research requirements, nor is the similar wind-powered water pump made by the same asset creator. How did I do that? Well, I wrote a script. That's available here on the script menu, and you can run it to enable wind power, so that the research is being carried out and you are then not blocked from using windmills to generate electricity. Okay, so that covers the research issue and why I have decided to use one of the assets that look like Halliday windmills, and I am sure that is exactly what the asset creator had in mind when he created it. He has two variations, one to work as a water pump and the other as a water well that does not require electricity, and that is the one I'm using. We saw in a number of the pictures that the windmill blades were often mounted directly above buildings, and I like that approach. But if we are not pumping the water through pipes to the village, then we need a way to pick up the water by truck, and you cannot load a water truck directly from a well. So I also combined the arrangement with this asset, which looks like a water tower, but it has the functionality in the game to store only a small amount of water and instead acts as a water loading-unloading station. It has a vehicle parking place for the water trucks to pull up next to it and get filled with water. I took the picture of the train loading with water as inspiration for that. The 3D model was not created by me, but the functionality as a loading station was. I would have loved to combine all three buildings into one single arrangement, but as they all need road connections, and there is a need for a small amount of underground pipe to connect the water well and the water loading, this was about the best I could do. That also keeps the pipe very short. Let's build that. So there we have water within this asset, and that's available now for trucks to pick up from there to collect the water. Let's set the skin on that. We have this light blue one with blue roof tiles, but I think this dark blue one is ideal, and let's buy some vehicles. Now they immediately can deliver water direct to individual buildings, but there's a lot of buildings in the village. It would work, but here in the middle of the village we want to set up somewhere where people can get the water. As I said, you can't put an actual well there. You must have something that operates in the game like a water substation. And I have another modded variation of the small water tower. In this case, it is not a water loading-unloading station, but a water substation. For a water substation, the water trucks can deliver to it using a footpath and without any proper parking. So that's fine here in this small area next to the village shop. I could use a substation that looks like the traditional village well with the bucket, but I decided to go with this instead. So we are clearer that we don't actually have a well here. Now, just to note that because of the pumping from the windmill up to the level of the water tank in the water loading station, none of this needs any actual vanilla water pumps, and this all operates without electricity. It relies on the water trucks, and they are currently slow, horse-drawn vehicles, of course, that don't carry much water. This sort of arrangement would probably not work well in a big city, even with better trucks. But we take advantage of the fact that the game developers have set it so the buildings need only 10% of the amount of water when it is being brought to them by truck compared to when it is piped to them. And to note, when the water is 10%, then the sewage is also 10%. So it's more efficient that the tech office basically has one place to drop off in the centre of the village. The water substation has connections to all of these buildings that I think need it. So the farm buildings here and the road depot, they don't need water, so they have no connection with the blue lines. The furthest building away looks like it's this one, which is the house where the Kovac family live, which is just 184 metres away. But we will need to remember that this will also be a limiting factor on the size of the village for anything that needs water. Now, it feeds water out virtually. There's no pipes required in the game between a water substation and the buildings it serves. And we can role play that people come out with their buckets and get the water from this asset in the village square. The only downside of doing it this way is apparent as soon as there is a delivery of water and we find the substation is empty. Every building in the village immediately tries to fill up their own internal tanks with water, and the small amount brought by these trucks immediately runs out. But after a few deliveries, the system should run okay and will rarely get messages from any buildings that they have no water. If we do, then we need to use more water trucks. And of course, you can use any tech office asset you want and have 8, 10, 12, etc. water trucks delivering water if you need to. This might result in a traffic jam eventually, but I think that we won't need more than 4. Any future development of the water system would be to bring a pipe from the well and not just use more trucks. A pipe will cause the water system to require 10 times as much water, but the well and substation would be able to handle that for this size village. We need to note from our discussion about water quality that there is no water treatment plant in this setup. The well suggested that we were far enough away from any sources of contamination to produce 95% water quality. Don't assume it is okay if it shows 95%. I think it would actually be just below 95%, but the figure is being rounded up in the display. If we go to a house, then we find a message that the water quality is too low. It is not saying there's not enough water, it is telling us that the water quality it is receiving is less than 95%. 95% is the level where the game regards the water as good enough quality to drink and no one gets sick. And below 95% is the level where these messages appear. So what does this mean to our villagers? It means they will have health issues. However, issues should be fairly small. I'm not saying they're insignificant or that you can ignore them completely. There is a lower health for your citizens and they do have lower life expectancy as a result of this. That's fine. This is 1910 after all. We shouldn't expect to have a very healthy population who all live until they are over 80 years old. As long as they don't all start dying off, we are okay. But to note, there will always be this annoying message for each building that water quality is too low. We probably don't need to do anything about it yet, but we need to consider that at some stage we not only need to pipe the water into the village, but we also need to treat the water and get it above 95%. In the meantime, we need to hope that some other serious health issue from pollution or an epidemic doesn't come along. The effect on the overall health of our people could be devastating. What I also want to do is something similar for sewage, and as I said, I could pipe the sewage out to the river, but I'm not going to do that. As soon as some of these houses are getting some water, then the internal sewage tanks in the buildings are starting to fill up, but it's slow as it's running at only 10%. We can get sewage trucks to go out and pick it up direct from the buildings, or we can have it centrally done through a sewage tank in the middle of the village. But we then need to do something with it. If we'd piped the water to the substation, the game requires both water and sewage to run at 10 times the amount. So that is one of the reasons why at this stage I've stuck to just having the vehicles bring water into the village. But it is not an issue if we can run a pipe and just dump it all in the river. Even a small sewage pipe would be sufficient to take it all away, and I don't really mind dumping it in the river. It's fine. We're not using the river for anything, and we're certainly not using it to draw drinking water out of it. None of that's a problem, but I'm going to do something a little bit different. While I was thinking about this, somebody asked on the Steam discussions what they could do if they're in a situation where they are nowhere near a river or lake. What do you do with the sewage? Of course, the game would allow you to take the sewage to the customs house, and pay your neighbours to take it away. That is another option here because Kazinchad is not that far from the customs house. I know it's a very common gameplay strategy, but I don't think it's very realistic. I can't imagine anywhere in the world where you could go to another country on your border and say, "Oh, I've got the sewage that I want rid of. Will you take it away?" And they'll say, "Oh yeah, that's fine. Just give it to us. We'll deal with it for you." Even if you're willing to pay them, I think you would get a far less polite response. I have seen people just dig a big hole in the ground so that they can get down to the water level and dump the sewage in that. And that's another pretty unrealistic option, even though the game allows you to do it. So I created an entirely new mod myself, which is night soil disposal. So it is this mod, and if you are very observant, you might be able to tell that this mod is the same 3D model used for the firewood merchant. The original modder created it for what he called a coal dealer that we covered in episodes 3 and 4, and I adapted that to make a firewood merchant that would burn firewood to provide heating in the village. But this new mod has a completely different functionality, so I even produced its own skin that uses this dark brown colour on the walls, so it looks different. But it is actually the same model if I turn that around. It's the same building with the yard at the back and the small single front door with the double gates to allow vehicles to go in the back. It has the same feature with parking in the yard, but this asset allows you to dispose of night soil. And what is night soil, for anyone who never heard that expression before? Night soil is the human waste products that were collected by people from your home. This seems to have happened from medieval times particularly, but maybe even earlier. Some cities had sewers that would take the waste away, but in cities without sewers, or easy access to a river or stream, where people could not easily get rid of their own waste, the night soil collectors would come around and collect it. They would come in the middle of the night when most people were sleeping, so you would leave the night soil out for them to collect. It was often referred to as soil because the waste would not be in a liquid format. They would use a pot or bucket which would be dry, and it would often have soil or ash in it, ash left over from a fire or soil dug out of the ground. So in reality what people did, and I know this is not a great topic for our discussion, but interesting from the historical point of view, basically what people did was like cat litter. The human waste did not go into water or any sort of chemical liquid. It went into a dry mixture with soil or ash that would then stop some of the smell. And then the night soil man would come and collect it. So we're going to have a night soil man who's going to collect the waste from all of these people. So I have adapted this 3D model and the texture and changed the functionality of it completely. We will look at that in a second. But this one is entirely my own mod. This is the night soil collection asset. I want to use the fact that I've got no collision so I can put this alongside the other asset. And I'm going to literally put it right up to that wall. So I made this asset so that it would look like it was part of the same building. That works great at that position. So let that build. I didn't quite do this 100% myself, but I have now learned myself how to make my own 3D models. Earlier I had started with 3D modeling by taking somebody else's model and changing it very slightly. But here I created the 3D model with the walls and the roof entirely. I still took somebody else's 3D model of the fences and the little cart that I used here because of course we've still got horse-drawn vehicles. I did all of the work to put the texture on this building, the roof tiles and the walls, but I've used the same texture file as on the night soil disposal, so that when you see the two little buildings next to each other and joined up like that, they look like they are one single building, but they are two separate assets in the game with separate functionality. So what is this? It is in reality a technical office. I've given it this special name for the significance of using it with the night soil disposal, and I have also changed it so that it only has the ability to run sewage collection. It does not have the ability to run water trucks or waste trucks or, well actually, there's nothing to stop you putting snowplows in here, so that doesn't make much sense. You can't mod it so that the snowplow functionality goes away, That's a default option on all technical offices. So I'm going to order vehicles as a workshop item. I want sewage wagons, so let me just order a couple of these for now, but I might need more than that. So they can park under the roof out of the rain a little bit, maybe a little like stables or something like that. Anyway, this is one of my first attempts to create 3D models. I didn't want to do something too complicated, so we basically have 3 walls with a slope on the 2 side walls and then a roof across the top. I've pretty much got the hang of using Blender to create my own 3D models and applying the texture. So I'm raring to go with some other ones, but I think I said at one stage I did not want to create this into completely a modding series. I want to stress here that I spent some time creating this because there was nothing like the night soil disposal and collection in the workshop. Absolutely nothing that would allow you to get rid of sewage other than dump it in our river. So the technical office functionality collects sewage and takes it to the night soil disposal building. The vehicles are not going to leave yet because none of the buildings have enough sewage in them for the technical office to start thinking I need to go and empty the sewage tanks. But it won't take long before things like the village shop will need to be emptied. So what's the disposal building doing? Let's look at that. The disposal building has inputs of wood and what it calls water here on the interface, but is in a sewage tank and also water in a water tank. There is some requirement to have clean water here shown by the blue icon, and there the import of dirty used water which is shown by the brown icon, in other words sewage. We need wood here, and it is a bit strange that we need clean water. I need to do something fairly specific with the water. You have to make sure there's some clean water in there because you run the risk that if the sewage tank fills up to 100%, which is only 10 cubic meters of dirty water, that this factory will stop working. I did play around with this extensively of how I could get this to work. What I wanted at first was something that would be like a sewage treatment plant in the game, that we would put in very dirty water and we would get out of it less dirty water, and that we would then go and take what remains by truck and dump it in the river. Something like that. So I was a bit surprised that it seems to require some level of clean water to be mixed with this. But I don't think we could necessarily say that this makes no sense from a role-play point of view. Though I think that looking at the historical descriptions, I don't see any real evidence that the night soil was disposed of using any water, except where it was dumped in a river. This was, for example, an issue in New York, where the night soil men would say they were going to properly dispose of it, but the unscrupulous ones would just throw it in the Hudson River. In the 1870s, the city council had to take steps to make this illegal. Tokyo today has a night soil treatment centre where the city council, I think, rather than the private business, will empty sewage tanks around the city. I couldn't read all the details in Japanese, unfortunately, but they definitely do something to dehydrate what they collect. In other words, dry it out before sending it to the city incinerator to burn it. So the wood simulates this. I said that generally the night soil men would want to collect waste which is already quite dry, but what we want to do is evaporate any liquid off, and that is done by heating it. It's not heated up a lot and the process doesn't need very much wood. Note, it is not burning the waste, it is just drying it. The game does not require much clean water in this process, but I couldn't get the system to work without there being at least some clean water in a tank in the night soil disposal. The main thing is we have a building which takes sewage. It needs workers and it needs a small amount of inputs from wood and water, and you end up with dry biological waste. Building outputs a product which is a type of waste instead of a liquid that goes in pipes. So again, I take the view that you shouldn't be able to just wave a magic wand and have sewage just disappear. This shouldn't be easy, but the cost of the wood wouldn't be much. And water is free, we just need to get it here. There's no requirement for particularly good quality water. The 94% water we have from our well is good enough. And then you have an export waste product which you have to deal with. If you build sewage pipes down to the river, these are not cheap. But once you do that, it completely gets rid of the sewage for free. You just put it in the river and forget about it. While here, there's always some sort of ongoing cost. And of course, you have to build the night soil disposal asset. So people playing realistic mode might not be happy with this solution. But I think it seems okay to me for Kazinchad. I'm prepared, of course, to have people make comments and thoughts on whether this makes any sort of sense to burn wood. But unlike the firewood merchant, it only needs to burn a very small amount to get rid of a couple of tons of sewage. And I think we're going to see in the village of this size that we are not going to generate huge amounts of sewage. And we are not going to have to bring an awful lot of water here. But the important issue for realism that affects gameplay is this is a factory. It needs workers here, and I've set it for a maximum of 4 workers. Though in practice, I've found that with the amount of sewage we get, it doesn't need that many. That maximum is set to prevent this from being used as an asset to get rid of sewage from a modern city. But I don't expect to need 4 workers. I think that makes a sewage disposal system which seems fairly balanced. It doesn't, I hope, cheat. I need an open-hauled vehicle to get some wood from the woodcutter. I'll just use a dedicated truck for this, that you're going to go at the woodcutter and bring wood back to the night soil disposal. You can wait for wood and you can wait for the night soil disposal to take it all off you. I should mention that because there is burning of the wood and handling of waste, that this is another building in the village that also produces some pollution. So that covers what we need for inputs. And the collection office should be sending out the sewage trucks by now to collect sewage to bring here. I just cut the video there because it actually took 10 days before there was enough sewage to collect. There is only 1/10 of the sewage because we are not using piped water, but we now have a sewage truck sent out by the night soil collection asset to collect sewage. Let's follow that. Surprisingly, it's turning away from the village. It must be going to the woodcutter. Maybe that makes sense because this is between 5 and 10 people working there every day, drinking water and producing sewage. It's our busiest workplace now. It hasn't actually collected much sewage, less than 1 ton, and is now heading to the disposal asset. So you see that some sewage appears in the dirty water tank. The factory then starts operating. A tiny amount of clean water and wood is used. We see some pollution from the chimney. Now we have biological waste. What are we going to do with the biological waste that is produced? I will cover in the very next episode the subject of waste in Kazinchad and how I propose to deal with waste of all sorts in a village situation before 1910. It deserves a topic of its own to be able to cover that. If you found that interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe, and you can get reminded when future episodes are available. My name is Mark from Canny Gaming, and I'm out of here.